So, are we ready to go then? Is that everyone, do we think?
I think so. Looks like we're good.
Wonderful. Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Inga the Unfettered. I live currently in Abacal, and I am also modernly known as Michelle Height. So if you look to seek me out at a later point, you can find me on Facebook under Michelle Height. My background in the SCA, I am a Laurel as well as a Pelican, and I've been a Royal, I'm a Duchess. So I've done a lot of different things in my lifetime in the SCA, and the thing that's sort of interesting for me about this particular topic is this is a new thing for me. So I want to be completely transparent. I was not laureled for my cooking prowess. I will be perfectly frank, until about 5 or 6 years ago, I was not even known for my cooking prowess. And so this is a new adventure for me, and me wanting to explore something new within the SCA and learning and really looking at, trying to find new things to keep engaged in the SCA. Part of my passion for this particular topic has come out of my household, which is very focused on doing really fabulous Viking recreation. And I actually got into cooking a few years ago when we were doing, we call it Vication, which is our Viking vacation. And we go away for a full week, and the whole household camps in this wonderful space, and we basically create this whole other Viking world. So more than just going to an event where we really are immersive. And in that space, I found that the one thing that I had not tried was the cooking. And so I'll be honest, in my mundane life, I'm actually one of the people that they usually ask to bring wine to a potluck. I am definitively not known for my cooking. So this is a really, really new and fun exploration. So in the handout that I've given you, it summarizes sort of my journey in doing that. And I like to sort of share a background. A lot of times we presume that someone who teaches about a thing is an expert. I like to be transparent about the fact that I'm not an expert in this. I also like to make sure that I am giving you sort of my path through this. So like I said, I started doing this as a result of my household. So I'm going to share a couple of pictures with you. And if you want to reference these later, I'm going to put in the chat the link to my Pinterest page where I've put all of these pictures for you to reference at a later point. So I'm going to share my screen really quickly and show you some photos. So can everyone see that?
That looks great.
Wonderful. Okay, so it's a little small, my apologies, but so this is our whole household down south, so down from Ontario, which is where my husband is originally from and that I used to be part of. You can see behind us there's a lovely pit house, and we actually built that, so we're really keen on the whole immersive thing. Then in terms of the next photo, you can see this is our camp. So we set up with a large an A-frame type structure to cook on. So all of the food that I'm going to talk about today has been prepared in this environment. So one of the things that I'm particularly sort of bonkers about in this is not just making food that's edible, but making food in a way that is at least a reasonable approximation of how it might have been made in the Viking era. So everything that we've made has been made over fire, and done in a very, as much as possible, very authentic way. And I'm just going to show you a couple of pictures. This is our camp late at night. It's really quite pretty. And here is me cooking. So the thing that is particularly joyful for me, and you'll probably get this from my handout, is that why I like medieval cooking, why I like Viking cooking, is the community aspect. I don't necessarily like making food just for feeding myself. I'm somebody who probably would joyfully eat crackers and cheese for the rest of my life if it was an option. But when it comes to the idea of preparing for a whole household and for us all cooking together, that is something that I was really keen to explore. And so, which is handy, because if you're going to make food like this, you really do need to have a lot of bodies sort of on hand and what have you. So I'm going to stop sharing this for now. Just wanted to sort of give you some background on me and who I am. Now, in terms of, and if you have any questions as we're going along, please don't hesitate to pose them. And actually, I'm not entirely against the idea of you unmuting and asking a pressing question if you have one, because to me, this is sort of part of the process. So hang on a second, I've lost my screen somehow. Sorry, everyone. There we are. Excellent. Sorry about that. So in terms of how I decided to really get into this, it was really related to what was a very timely publication, which is The Early Meal. Now, I don't know if everybody has heard of this. It's listed in the references for the handout, but this is the book that I was working from. I see a few people holding it up. Wonderful, wonderful. So I was quite fortunate that right about the time when I started to get excited about making Viking dishes, this book came out. Now, why this book is unusual, and there's a lot of writing out there about period cooking, what makes the Early Meal of Viking Age cookbooks so special is that it's not just a list of, ooh, maybe they ate this, but there is actually at the back, and this is one of the things that I really love, is at the back this listing of where the different elements were found in terms of dig finds. So I love the fact that it actually brings all of these things back to the actual dig find. There's this lovely index at the back of the book for anyone who doesn't own it that actually shows ingredients and where they were found. And to me, the idea of having our exploration of Viking food be connected to not just what I thought was yummy or what our food preferences in the household were, but actually what was found in terms of probable food. That's really exciting to me. I like the idea that I could be eating a thing that was plausibly attainable within the Viking Age. So this book coming out at that time when I was deciding that my sort of place in, hold up the front of the book again, yes, there we go. And it's listed in the index of the handout as well. So what was really exciting about that is then instead of it just being, like I said, interested in food, interested in very documentable or really plausibly documentable food. So it was kind of handy for me that I got excited about food right about the same time that this book came out. So what I've gone through is tried a number of the recipes that are found in this book. And what I want to share with you today is just my adventures in actually doing that. So like I said, I'm not here necessarily to tell you how it has to be done, but rather what I have done. So in terms of the dishes that we've made, I'm going to go through a few of them, but what was really interesting to me when I was going through the book and looking at the plausible ingredients is there's ingredients that we would think were pretty common, like rye and walnuts that actually weren't all that common in the period that I'm looking at, which is early to middle Viking Age. And then other ingredients that you might think might be rare, like plums or strawberries, actually were available. So that was, to me, interesting because it sort of challenges what you might think would be the kind of food that Vikings would eat. Some of them might be, more sort of special occasion ingredients, certainly, but the idea of looking at what was actually part of their regular diet was interesting to me. Unsurprisingly, grain-heavy dishes is very, very documentable, very, very likely. I mean, that doesn't come as any surprise whatsoever. But what was really interesting to me was the different ways in which they likely could have been combined. So in terms of the different dishes we tried, I'm going to just sort of walk you through some of the things that we made, and if you have questions, let me know. So the first one that I did was actually, I made skyr, which if anyone is familiar, is a very, very soft cheese. You can serve it almost like a yogurt, or you can dry it to more of a dense sort of soft cheese. It's quite delicious. And I was amazed at how easy that was to make. The first time I made skyr, I told everybody, "Ooh, I'm going to make it," and everyone just presumed I'd made it tons of times. I'd never made it before. I just figured I'd give it a whirl. And what was beautiful about that is that it actually turned out, which was pretty exciting to me. In terms of the process, the thing that was really interesting as well was when you're making cheese, one of the side effects is you end up having quite a bit of whey. And we know that they used the whey as a pickling agent for a lot of products. I got the skyr culture actually from a modern skyr here that you can buy. It's easy to buy in Canada. I think it's increasingly easier to find in other places. I have also used kefir as a culture agent, because while it is not necessarily Viking, the culture and the substance is similar, and sometimes it's easier to find that through some of your more exotic food markets. So kefir works as well as a culture agent. So when we prepared the skyr, it was made from creme fraiche, sour milk, salt, and then the culture, as I mentioned. You prepare it and then hang it to dry overnight, and you drain out all that whey. And the whey ends up being used in a lot of the cooking. So one of the other dishes that I'm going to mention in a moment is we cook Swiss chard, and chard can be very fibrous. And what we discovered through, just wonderful experiment is how lovely it is when it actually gets cooked in whey. One of the other things that we spent a lot of time on is trying different kind of porridges. So this was an interesting challenge because we actually have some gluten and intolerant people in our household. And so we were looking at what other ways could we prepare food. As it happens, barley is, buckwheat is plausible within the Viking Age. And it is also, for those who don't know, completely suitable for those who have to have a gluten-free diet. So we've experimented with both the barley porridge, which of course is very standard. I mean, I'm just quite used to that in Viking or in medieval cooking in general, but then also with that buckwheat. And we've prepared both a savory and a sweet form of that, created, done very, very simply, adding in simple root vegetables, a little bit of bacon ends, that sort of thing, root vegetables, or done a sweet version with cream and honey, which is really quite nice. And I'll show you some pictures in a couple of minutes. What was really interesting though about that is we discovered that the buckwheat, and I know it's not technically a grain, but it's a seed related to wheat. But what it does is it is, however, is a documentable material, grain-like material that can be found in the Viking accessible area. And what it does is it allows you to recreate a lot of the porridges they might have eaten in a way that was also accessible to gluten sensitive diets. So I know that's a bit of an accommodation, but it is a plausible substitution. On the other side of things, it's also incredibly delicious. So that's also really nice. We also did a lot of root vegetables, not a surprise, glazed, buttered, that sort of thing. They're quite lovely. And thank you for the contribution. I don't mind at all. And then one of the things that we did a lot of cooking with was the chard. Now, for me, I'd not cooked Swiss chard before. It's a very common Scandinavian vegetable, but it can be quite fibrous. And with the first time we cooked it, it was, I'll be honest, it was a bit stringy. It was a little like sort of eating the fibers in your celery. And what we found is when you cook it in the whey, it comes out so sweet and so soft and succulent. It was actually really quite amazing. So you're saving that whey, and we know that they used whey for pickling and preserving throughout the Viking Age. That's well known. What was delightful though is to find out how nicely it changed the food when we actually cooked with it. Now, if you don't have whey, the alternate that we used was dark beer. If you're able to have beer as a cooking, as a substance to cook with, my goodness, it does lovely things to char as well. And then, of course, we cooked some beef and what have you. So that's pretty standard sort of fare. But if you go through in the early meal book, you can see there's a lot of different variations of basically a grain or grain type, and then a vegetable or a fruit type. Again, none of this is all that extraordinary, but what was really interesting is how lovely it came out cooking it over a fire with very rudimentary tools at our disposal. The last thing I want to mention is bread. And there's a lot of interesting documentation about bread in, there's finds from various grave goods, but also from, just the general midden finds. We cooked a Viking crisp bread, and I'll show you some pictures of it. I'm quite delighted with it because it actually looks very similar to the extant pieces that we found. And I've cooked it both as a simple rye and wheat flour mixed with salt and water, also added in cumin. There's some research that says they may have had access to cumin. It surely is yummy. It's debatable though, so we've made it in both versions. The lovely thing is that it can be cooked to the point where it's quite dry, and there's records of even till actually quite recently, it's one of sort of traditional ways of preparing bread in Norway in particular, where they create bread that they punch holes through and it gets hung in the rafters and gets consumed for quite a long time. And I actually have a little piece of the bread that we've made. So this is, you can see this. This is some of the flatbread that we've made. And we made it in a couple of different sizes. I've got a few pieces, some smaller fragments. What is awesome about this is this batch is 2 years old. And it is still, and I'll prove it because I'll actually eat a piece of it. It's dry as blazes. but it's lovely and crunchy like a dense cracker. And it preserves for virtually forever, which is a really wonderful thing because you think about the sort of cycle of having access to these things. Sorry, it's a bit dry. It's really dry. Anyways, there's a lot of times in more of the medieval approach with the crisp bread, they would sort of do it in one great big giant batch, would be stored for a very long time, and you just break off bits as you go. There's some mention to having bread hung on ropes in the boat. Some theories about that. The beautiful thing is basically this allows you to create a nice dense bread that lasts for a very long time. It works as a bit of a plate. You can serve food on it. It's a wonderful scoop for things like dense, like a nice soup or a porridge. It softens up quite nicely if you expose it to any kind of water. But I was just so delighted to be able to create a bread that not only is a practical, useful, and actually it's still quite yummy, but at the same time nicely mirrors what we found in the grave finds. Someone asked if we've cooked in ceramic pots. We have not been cooking in ceramic pots. What I've been cooking in, well, I shouldn't say not cooking. We have cooked less in ceramic pots. We have one lovely one that we use. The challenge is that a lot of the Viking age cook pots are actually soapstone, and there's actually very few, I wouldn't say very few, but not as many ceramic pots in that time period as you might expect. Soapstone was actually really plentiful, and you actually need less skill to make a pot out of a piece of soapstone. Have I tried cooking in my soapstone pot? Yes, I have. Mine's quite small. I've done let me see, actually, I'm going to see if I can grab it here. Mine is quite tiny. It's like a little personal pot or ladle. It was meant as an experiment to be able to determine if I could make one, and then that plan this summer is to actually make a proper soapstone pot for cooking in. Soapstone, though, is brilliant. So can everybody see that? Okay. Yeah, I super love it. So a lot of, especially the Northern Viking age cooking implements are actually made out of soapstone. So we haven't used a ton of clay. I've used the smaller soapstone. We've honestly used the cast iron for practical reasons. It's just accessible. And then I have a lovely hand-forged like proper Viking age pot that was recently made for me that is by a fellow here in Abacal, Schmidt, it's absolutely amazing. And it's just the coolest thing in the world because it's this great glumpy, riveted metal beast. It's so wonderful. And so it needs reseasoning every year with porridge so that it feels the cracks, because otherwise it's a bit leaky, but which is also, I think, really wonderful. I love getting to use that. So in terms of the dishes, I'm going to now share my screen and show you some pictures of the dishes that we've prepared that I've mentioned. Just getting my mouse to play nice here. There we go. So I'm going to share my screen again with you. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Can I get some thumbs up somewhere? Okay, perfect. So, so that was me cooking, as I mentioned. So this is us cooking over the fire. We have a lovely hanging rack that's based on the Master Mirror find that we cook strips of meat on. You can take really, not all that great chunks of meat, and if you cut it thin and then roast it like that, it comes out quite lovely. So this is us cooking over the fire pit, getting ready to make dinner. So we usually start with a bit of bacon ends or fat to get the cooking started. It seasons the bottom of the pot, but also nobody ever seems to mind if you cook with bacon. Here is bacon ends and onions to start. So this is the Swiss chard. This is the result of the Swiss chard cooked in bacon ends and onion and whey. So you can see it's cooked down to a really nice soft, pleasant to enjoy. It's not fibrous at all. We did the barley cooked in bacon ends, onions, carrots, celery, and parsnips. Also a lovely addition to the pot. And then behind that is the Swiss chard with bacon ends. This is a closer look at the barley cooked with bacon, onions, and root vegetables. And this is it before we sort of warmed it up a little, or before we cooked it a little bit more. So it gets a lovely warm color as it cooks. Green beans just with bacon ends and onions, really yummy. I'm sure that's not really tricky to imagine, but surprisingly different over the fire. And this is, I think, one of the things that I really enjoyed is that the cooking over the fire really does change the result. Some of these dishes just simply aren't as nice when cooked over the stove. And I don't know that I know, maybe it's partly being cooked in the cast iron. Maybe it's just the open flame, but the results are really, really yummy. I'll be honest, what's that?
Excuse me, is it possible to make the pictures larger?
Let me
they
see.
come up big and then they jump down to really tiny.
There we go. Here, let me zoom in a little bit. I'll have to zoom. It's fighting me for some reason, so my apologies.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you for letting me know. The pictures are also in the link I shared with you on Pinterest. So if you want to look at them again later, I posted them all on Pinterest for you. So now I'm not sure if it's going to let me scroll through these though, now that I've zoomed in. There we go. So we'll zoom in again. So this is us cooking in the clay pot. So the middle pot is a dish actually that isn't on my handout, and it's one that we picked up when we were traveling in Scandinavia. It is a clay pot crammed full of chopped up cabbage, coarse salt, and then topped with beer and just let to sit in the coals. And it's really good. And it comes out really lovely in the clay pot. We have two clay pots in the household. The rest of it we've been doing in the cast iron, just because for practical reasons it's a lot easier to attain. Getting people who make clay pots that you can cook in is actually kind of a challenge. So this is us cooking the cabbage in beer. So like I said, we chop up cabbage, layer it with a bit of salt all the way through, and then use the cabbage leaves as a cap on it. And as it cooks, that sort of curls, and really basically by the time the cabbage leaf on top looks all sad and tragic, it means it's pretty much ready to serve. So, and on to the next picture. There we go. So here we go. There's the cabbage cooked in beer. You can see we have some lovely long wooden spoons, and I want to say that's one of the things that was an interesting challenge is we were using modern wooden spoons, and they're not long enough to be comfortably working over a fire for hours with. After the first week of it that we did it, the back of my hands were actually sunburnt from the fire, and so we ended up actually having one of the local fellows carve some longer spoons for us so we're not quite so close. Okay, and on to the next photo. And I am watching the chat, so if you have any questions, please let me know. So this is a close-up again of the barley and the char, which I don't think we got a close-up on before. And you can see here, we've got the firebox divided. There's a log here. One side was filled with the actual active fire. The other side just has coals. So using the coals to keep dishes warm while actively cooking on the other side. So that's one of the advantages of having these long, this is the other end. We're starting dessert here. Having the long firebox really allows you the luxury of cooking, having several different spots of heat. And what we often do is we have one end, we'll have the hanging rack with meat. Then in the middle, we have the fire with the hanging pots where things are actively boiling. And then we have coals at the other end where we're transferring dishes that are ready or dishes that need to sit, like the cabbage. With the buckwheat, we usually do it with cream and honey and either apples or berries. It's really quite lovely that way. And one of the things that's really interesting about that is exactly how far buckwheat goes. I don't know how much cooking with buckwheat anyone else here has done, but the first time I soaked buckwheat to prepare the dishes, I used the same sort of measure and expectation as I would with barley, and buckwheat goes about 1 billion miles further. It filled 2 entire cast iron pots from the amount that we soaked in a single bowl. It just will soak and soak. And the beautiful thing about that is then it's also really inexpensive. I did a demo the summer before in Calgary, and we gave out 150 samples of food, and it cost me about $5 in buckwheat. It's so if you're looking for a really economical way to feed a large camp and you can cook it both savory and sweet, it's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. Barley is also not that expensive either, but the difference between how far barley goes versus buckwheat, I would say it's at least half again. It's really quite amazing. And here we go. And so this is the skyr. So we prepared the skyr in a cast iron pot. You have to, if anybody here has made cheese, you basically heat the milk liquids and all the ingredients until you get an inversion where there's a very clear separation of solids from whey. Then you drain it and you hang it to dry. So here is our actually fairly icky looking cheese hanging in some very thin linen hanging from the tree. One thing about buckwheat, and a couple of people are making some comments about buckwheat, is that buckwheat can either come in a toasted or a non-toasted variety. If you buy it from bulk places, it often looks a little bit sort of yellow or green. It hasn't been toasted. You can also buy it already toasted, or you can toast it yourself. You definitively want to toast it. It makes it taste nicer. It gives it sort of a nuttier, yummier texture, but it also makes it hold its own structural integrity, because otherwise what you end up having is it gets a bit mushy. And because it's a bit yellowy green, it's also not particularly lovely looking. So you end up with sort of this mushy, and it's delicious looking, but the eye feasts first. It is not your eye doesn't feast on that. So I definitely with that would recommend toasting the buckwheat first. So here's the skyr drying, or draining rather. And here is the skyr drained. I toast it before soaking. And here is the skyr. We drained it quite dry. Mostly we wanted to have as much whey as possible for the cooking, but also we were curious to see how close it would actually come out to like a cheese, like a nice soft cheese, which is exactly what it came out to. We've prepared this also with putting some herbs and what have you into it. That is also quite nice, but it's really delicious all by itself. And here I'm just showing off my lovely pot with my wax linen cover because it's pretty. So, oh, this one is, let me zoom in. We had skyr that failed. Yeah, isn't that a lovely bowl? How long do you drain it to get it that dry? Overnight. We hang it up in the tree because then the dogs don't get at it, and leave a pot underneath it, and the dogs don't seem to like the whey, so that's kind of handy. We usually drain overnight for it to get that dry. You can eat it faster than that. You can press it through the cloth to get it to be more like a yogurt, which is what I think most people are used to seeing skyr as. But having traveled all through Scandinavia, I've seen it in various forms, and it certainly is yummy in all of its different forms. We had skyr that couldn't get the solids to separate properly. And so we used steel cut oats for this. We just figured we didn't want to waste the dairy product, so we soaked it overnight in the skyr with a little bit of cinnamon because that's nice. And the next day we made a lovely porridge out of it. So this is the oatmeal made from oats soaked in skyr. It might be the nicest oatmeal I've ever had. It was so creamy because every bit of liquid that the oats had soaked up was dairy, not water. So really quite lovely. And there you can see my lovely long spoon again. I'm pretty pleased with it. So, and you can see we have a couple of metal pots that are medieval-esque. This is not actually the one that was made for me. And I unfortunately didn't have a picture of us using it, which is really sad because it's incredibly cool. Here is another shot of the buckwheat with cream honey. We usually throw a little bit of cinnamon in it and berries. It's amazing. The cool thing about this is it is really nice hot or cold, so you can leave it, set it aside on the grass, put a cloth over top of it, and then the next morning serve it cold out of the pot. We've found that the kids like it so much that I have to actually put it somewhere they can't find, because they'll get into it and eat it before we're ready to and eat it in lieu of when we were planning to eat it, which is really nice. Having a dish that the kids in the household like that much is pretty darn handy. So buckwheat with honey and cream, huge hit with the kids. So, and we usually have a pretty large encampment, so that's kind of handy. This is me cooking the bread. What's the alternative to buckwheat? You could also use, of course, steel cut oats, or you could use barley. For any of the porridge type dishes, we've used either the barley or the buckwheat, depending. Like I said, we largely have adopted having a mix of both because we have several members in the household that can't have gluten. That does make it a little trickier to not have cross-contamination in a medieval kitchen, I'll be completely honest with you, but we've done really well. We haven't managed to give anyone in the household an unhappy tummy yet. So this is me cooking the little breads. This is my lovely Master Mirror pan on the Master Mirror grate over the fire in my backyard. Actually, I was we're out and I wanted to make some more. And I've gotten to the point where I like to, I don't actually like to make them in my modern kitchen anymore. I really like to make them over the fire. They come out nicer. How do you toast the buckwheat? A relatively dry cast iron pot over the fire, and you just stir them slowly till they start to brown. You can also do it in your modern kitchen. That is also quite easy if you prefer. Like I said, I very often will buy it pre-toasted. There's an Italian center here in Edmonton that sells it from Europe that's already pre-toasted, and is so yummy. And I'll be honest, it makes our life a little easier not having to worry about toasting it on site as well. But toasting it in the cast iron pot works really, really well. Okay, that's my bread. That's my little Birka loaves. And there's a lovely stack of the Birka loaves that I showed you on the screen earlier, these lovely fellows. We have, I think I have a picture of them. There we are. We keep them strung on rope in the camp, just in the kitchen. And so that way you can just grab a piece if you like. Doesn't work as well if it's pouring rain, but we have a pretty large awning, so we keep them strung up there or strung inside the tent. Oh yes, Ursula's reminding everyone to please sign up on the attendance sheet so you get credit for the course. Okay, and let me just get back to the photos. And that, I think, is the last photo, so let me stop sharing. Perfect. Okay, so let me just grab my handout now to see what else I want to share. Okay, so now there's a couple of practical things I wanted to mention to you if you're thinking about trying any of these recipes in a period fashion. Some very practical things. The handout should have been sent out by Ursula to attendees. Ursula, can you send it again? Okay, Ursula's going to send it out if you didn't receive it. So one of the things I found is that the reason why this cooking is awesome is because it's done in a group. It's literally impossible to do this alone. And, you know, between trying to maintain the fire, make sure you have enough water, have things being started and stopped when needed. If you have a team, so what we always have done is we have one person's in charge of making sure that the fire is maintained. Another person who's actually in charge of getting wood, because those are two different tasks. Someone to make sure that we've got water, and then whoever's cooking. And what we found is that makes it incredibly fun, but it also makes sure that you don't run into trouble. I've tried to do this almost by myself, and what ends up happening is you cannot get everything done at the right time, because keeping on top of the fire is a single project by itself, and you really need to have somebody whose job it is to just keep an eye on the fire. That said, if you have that kind of a team, I've cooked with my it's usually myself, Merowyn, and Aaron. We've cooked for a camp of 30 for a week over this setup, and had no difficulty having everybody well fed, and also be able to hit the timing of breakfast. We usually do a breakfast / lunch and then dinner, just usually 2 meals. But if you have those people, it's easy to pull that off. We're very often usually working on different sort of Viking projects. And so it takes about 2 hours to get from checking the fire to make sure things are ready to go to having food done. But with the support, you can feed that many people quite easily. It's actually pretty cool to see how, if you do it as a community, how effortless this much food actually is. I mean, feeding 25 to 30 people, it sounds like a pretty brutal undertaking. If I was going to do that in my own kitchen, I would probably be absolutely exhausted by the end of that meal, right? That's not a small thing. Doing it in this way, I've often found we sit down and it's not it's sort of, oh, now when we move on to the next thing, I'm not exhausted by that. The fire is the really hard part. Definitely recommend using charcoal. We use you can use briquettes as well, but we have access to the actual wood charcoal, and that is so much nicer. In terms of practical considerations for food, like I said, the grains and buckwheat go much further than you think. So maybe experiment with the expansion. Our first time I did a bag that was about this big, so a tiny little bag. And like I said, it filled 2 entire cast iron pots. It was actually astounding how much grain we had left. We ended up taking some home after an entire weekend. That's a lot of food. You also need more tools than you would think. In your kitchen, you readily can just grab a clean knife or clean underneath the tap. When you're doing this, you need more of those tools. So you need more knives handy for if you're handling anything that can be, you have to worry about cross-contamination or, making sure you're not, getting anything sort of unhealthily contaminated. You need a lot more wooden spoons than you might think. We have about 8 really nice ones, including, I have a gorgeous ladle that's designed on the Burka ladle, which the Burka ladle is a big clay bowl with a wooden handle coming out of it. And it allows you to be about 3 feet away from the food while you're stirring, which is amazing. But you cannot possibly have too many of these tools at hand, because you don't want to be moving from pot to pot necessarily. It's not always nice to be able to cross-contaminate, obviously. And if anytime you move it, you don't have that option of just rinsing it out in the sink. So definitely recommend having lots of tools at the ready. Also things like cutting boards and what have you, really important. We have a lovely long cutting board that is really just sort of looks like a little tiny ironing board. It's a beast. But it allows us to do all of our root vegetable prep in one spot, that sort of thing. So in terms of, those sort of preparatory things, the tools that let you do this, those ended up being the thing that got in our way initially. And then as soon as we got the tools that we wanted, it really made a huge difference in terms of success. One of the things that we did have, it's not necessarily documentable because it's a pipkin, which has the little legs, but we used a pipkin over the fire to keep water warm all the time. It was always on the coals, so that if you were in a spot where you had to rinse something, you always had hot water at the ready. What I now have, I just received this summer, was one of the little beer, Mastermere trivets. And so now we keep a clay pot with, over the trivet in the fire all the time for the same reason. It just allows you to have that hot water for quick rinsing at the ready. And it wasn't one of the things that we'd ever thought of before. And we'd started doing it just because I love tea. So I always wanted to have some handy. We realized how often we end up using my tea water for other things. But it was an infinitely practical thing. And then when you don't have that option of having a sink at the ready, it really made a huge difference. And then the last thing is, make sure that you are keeping an eye on that fire, especially if the weather is at all inclement. If you've not cooked over a fire, it's not like starting a fire that you can sit around and socialize around. Having a fire you can cook on takes at least an hour to build up that coal base. That is not a just click the stove and go. And so it means if you're going to do this, you need to have somebody who is going to go over to camp, start the fire, and when it's ready, you get to come back and do your cooking. That is the preparatory component that you can't race. And if the weather is poor, it can really be a challenge. So, definitely recommending that. One of the things that we've done is we have a sunshade that is has quite an overhang. And so that firebox setup can be moved. There's handles at either end, the rods go all the way through. And so we can move it underneath that awning in case of really poor weather. And that's actually been really quite lovely because, we camp down to the Pacific Northwest all the time. So the number of times you're camping in the rain is larger than often. So in terms of what would I do different, the biggest thing for me is I want to get more into the exploration of the period tools. So I'd want to now do more cooking on the soapstone. Now that I've figured out how to make the soapstone implements, I figured out it's actually incredibly easy. I can't even imagine trying to make a clay pot that would survive being cooked in. I made that ladle in about an hour and a half. So to me, that is just that will take it to the next take that to the next level for me. The other thing is I've traveled, to be honest, just make sure everyone knows, I've traveled all through Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Germany. I've been to all of the museums, and one of the things you see over and over again is how much of the cooking implements were the soapstone. So to me, as much as the metal is, it's obviously the sexy thing, everybody wants to bring out that really cool metal pot. I want to see how different the experience actually is cooking on the soapstone on a larger scale, because I think that is that's going to be one of the things that really changes the not just the texture, but also the taste. And I think also the cooking time. Soapstone takes a while to heat up, but it holds heat for so much longer. And I have a suspicion that it's going to allow us to do dishes like, for example, the cabbage much faster, because once you get it up to heat, I can take it out of the way and I don't have to take up space on my cooking surface, and I can move on to other things. So I think it's going to actually make our cooking faster in some ways. I think that's sort of the big thing for me, is moving to have even more of the accurate implements to see how that impacts the food. Absolutely. Does anybody have any other questions? I've given you a pretty good resource list. There's a soapstone is a period slow cooker. Absolutely, that is certainly seems to be the case. The interesting thing about soapstone also is, for anyone who's unfamiliar with this, is when you heat soapstone, it gets harder. If anybody who's worked with metal or stone knows of the Rockwell test, which measures the density or the hardness of a thing, soapstone goes from, you know, markable with your thumbnail, which most people are probably familiar with, to almost like an actual stone in terms of the surface once you cook on it. And so they go from being kind of vulnerable, soapstone is, to being really quite dense and hard and resilient once they've been cooked in a few times. And so to me, that's also exciting, because pottery is terrifying to me. We have 2 beautiful pots that we can cook in, and I'm constantly in fear that we're going to break them, because pottery, no matter how much you use it, is vulnerable, and it shocks, and you have to warm it up slowly, and there's all sorts of things related to that. That's actually a point for anybody who's not cooked in clay. You have to warm it up very slowly. So for example, the pot that we do with the cabbage, you have to slowly move it towards the coals, then slowly turn it. If you move it directly into the coals, you will shock the pottery and it'll break. So that's definitely one of the less awesome parts. How many recipes have I tried from the book, and do I have a blog or Facebook page? You know, actually, I have some things on my Facebook page that document my period cooking adventures. So if you want to, you know, you can find me on Facebook. My name is Michelle.Height, or Michelle Height. So 2 E's, 2 L's, and then Height. I can actually rename myself really quickly. That'll make it easier for you. Here we go, Michelle Height. There you go. There's my name. So, so if you can definitely find me there. In terms of the recipes, I've done a bunch of these. I've also done some from other sources. So there's a source that I've cited in the resources, the Reba Viking Center. They have done wax of recipes rather. They're just nuts about it. So I've also done a bunch of theirs. I've tried most of the porridges. One of the big things that I want to do in here that I haven't done yet is there is actually blood bread, where they use blood as one of the components that makes black bread. I know it's a bit like, some people are like, but to me, that would be so cool. So I definitely want to try that. Where do you find soapstone large enough to make cooking size pots? That's a different challenge. I'm lucky in Edmonton. There's a company that provides resources to people who carve large art projects, which means they bring in soapstone. I can get a soapstone piece as big as my desk if I wanted. It's about $1.50 a pound, so that's a lot of poundage. It's not cheap, I'll be honest. But finding a place that supplies it, you're going to need to look for a place that supplies people that do carving. It's not easy to find. That said, you can buy simple soapstone pots online. Again, they're not cheap, and certainly the shipping is interesting because they're very, very heavy. But it's exciting to me. And like I said, I'm lucky. I'm privileged to live somewhere where getting soapstone is not the hard part. It's actually the carving is the time-consuming component. Yeah, no flame on pottery. It's not good. So you really have to become really careful with your clay. Yeah, soapstone will get very, very crazy dense. So I'm really pleased with the results I've had so far. I'm really excited about it. The best thing is that these handled bowls, this one's fairly small. It's like a ladle size. There are oodles of these found. When I was in Iceland just recently, there's a display that has like 5 or 6 of them, and they're about this big around. Like they would be like a personal pot type of size. So you can imagine you'd warm up a bit of food or something in it. So they're clearly were sort of an everyday implement. They're often quite rough finished. So it definitely suggests that these were a very practical daily use item as opposed to something that was, super fancy treasure type of thing in the household. Okay, so it looks like we only have about 10 minutes left, and I don't want you to be racing to your next class. Does anybody want to ask me any more questions?
I'll share the attendance link one more time just for those who may have missed it in amongst all the questions.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've heard putting pieces of soapstone in the US can be really hard. Definitely. And I think the last piece of recommendation that Thank you so much, everyone. I think the last recommendation I would make is that all of these things don't require that you're already a good cook. Like, I cannot tell you how bad of a cook I was before I started doing this. I was infamous for being the person that they asked me to bring, like, the wine to the potluck. Embracing this is about, to me, about community and about trying simple food well done. And that, to me, is attainable to anybody. Okay, and so I encourage you to really try it out. This is not an expensive book, by the way, an early meal. It's not a pricey book to pick up. And there's a lot of other lovely books. The other one, now this one is expensive, but if you're interested, it's in my index as well, the Nordic Cookbook. This is a modern book, but it's I can see a few people holding it up. It's a modern book, but it is a take on a lot of traditional dishes. And so I found it also to be quite useful. Both of them are available on Amazon. And I found it a very interesting book to get different takes on ways to approach ingredients, to combine ingredients, and then using the early meal as a reference point for what was known to be found in terms of ingredients, then looking at these more traditional but more modern recipes and seeing where there is a connection. And so that's one of the things that I've been doing a little bit more of lately, as well as seeing what sort of bridges there are between the two. Yeah, Magnus Nilsson is amazing. He's a super fantabulous person. I have his Nordic cookbook, and I also have the Nordic baking book. And if you're a baker, the baking book is incredible, like just absolutely phenomenal. So I recommend it heartily. Excellent. So is there any other questions then before I wrap up and let you get to some of your other classes? I'm going to give you my email address here really quickly if you have any questions, because I know we went over things quite quickly, and I don't think I included it in my handout, which is an oversight on my part. So I'm going to give you my email address. If you have any questions, you are also welcome to email me rather than find me on Facebook if that is more convenient for you. I'm more than glad to share anything that I've learned. Like I said, I don't pretend to be an expert on this, but I do pretend to be an enthusiast. So I'm more than glad to share what I've learned. Also, everything that I've showed you in terms of pictures can be found in my Pinterest page. Feel free to use and look as much as you like. I'm more than glad to share what I've, the adventures I've had. So.
Thank you so much, Your Grace. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.